Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 365 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. And this episode, we're talking about the mystery of the year. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Every 365 and a quarter days, the Earth goes around the sun. But people have had different ideas about the year and how it should be divided. There have been a wide variety of calendars in world history, and there are many calendars in use today. So how do they work? How have they changed over time, and how did we get our own calendar? Well, that's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, I understand you wanted to begin today's episode with a personal story. What did you want to tell us?
Well, this kind of fulfills the personal connection that we often mention at the beginning of episodes. Now, obviously, everyone has a personal connection with the year since we all experience it, annually, in fact. But I've had a special interest in the year ever since I was small. In particular, I've had a special interest in calendars and timekeeping systems, not just the one we use here in America, but ones used all around the world and in different times. This leads to a story from my childhood. I would guess that I was in junior high at the time, though I don't remember the exact year. My mother and I were at the Northwest Arkansas Mall, which was a major shopping venue here in Fayetteville at the time. It still exists, but malls have fallen on hard times now, so it's not as busy. But back then, it was prime time for malls. And my mother and I were in a bookstore because this was back in the day when bookstores were a thing. While my mom was shopping, I discovered a strange book. It was large and had a paperback cover and a stapled spine. It was kind of like a large, oversized magazine, except that it had a heavier cover. It also didn't have glossy paper inside, and the inside was black and white. What struck me about the book, though, was that it was all about world calendars, different calendars used in different parts of the world, with all different kinds of charts and diagrams and tables and illustrations, and I was really fascinated by it. It was totally awesome. Unfortunately, even though my parents gave me an allowance, I didn't have the money for it, so I asked my mom if she might buy it for me. She said no, and I was disappointed. And this was, the days before Amazon, so you couldn't just save up your money and buy the book later. You had to leave it in the store, and if someone else bought it, it would be gone when you came back. My mom continued browsing, and I continued looking disappointedly through the world calendar book. The truth was, I was also hoping my mom would notice how interested in the book I was and how disappointed I was, and she did. As she was getting ready to pay, she came up behind me and kindly said, "You can't take your eyes off it, can you?" And I said, "No," and she bought me the book. I was so happy, and afterwards I treasured the book and spent endless hours looking through it. I kept it for years, and I should still have it because I would never have gotten rid of it. It was a gift from my mom that I've always treasured. So I wanted to tell this story because it was a moment of kindness that I really treasure in my heart, and I wanted to tell the story in honor of my mom.
That's awesome. That's a really touching story. So let's talk about the year itself. How far back in history does the concept go?
Well, among Homo sapiens, I think it goes back at least as long as Homo sapiens do. That is, for our subspecies' entire history. Because Homo sapiens lived for decades, and so they'd lived through tens of years. During those tens of years, they'd notice the climate around them changing. If they lived near the equator, they might notice that sometimes it was really rainy, but other times it was not nearly as rainy. And they'd notice that these two periods alternated. You'd have a rainy stretch of time, then a dry stretch of time, then a rainy stretch of time, and so on. You'd thus identify what are now called the rainy season and the dry season that locations near the equator may have. If you were a little farther from the equator, you might notice three recurring periods, like, for example, in Egypt, the Nile River would flood every year. That became known as the season of inundation. Then the waters would recede, which became known as the season of emergence, since the land would emerge from the waters that had inundated it. It was also when the plants would really begin growing once the waters receded and the plants could get water. And then there would be the period of low water, which became known as the dry season, or after the agricultural revolution, the season of harvest, now that the plants were done growing. So Egypt had inundation, emergence, and the dry season. Over in Thailand, they didn't have the Nile River, but they did notice that part of the time it would be really hot, then it would get rainy, and then it would get cold. So they also recognized 3 seasons. In much of the world, farther away from the equator, they would notice 4 periods of time. During part of the year, it would be really cold and you'd get snow and ice. Then it would get warmer and the plants would start growing. Then it would get really hot. And then it would start to get cooler again and the leaves would change color and fall off the trees, giving us the 4 seasons of winter, spring, summer, and fall. And then if you were really far away from the equator, it would be pretty cold all the time. That would change somewhat. But what you'd really notice was how much daylight you had to work with. Sometimes the days would be getting longer and longer. And if you were far enough away from the equator, you'd even hit a period where it was daylight all the time. Then the days would start getting shorter and shorter. And again, if you were really far away from the equator, you'd hit a period where it was night all the time, and then the cycle would start over again. So it didn't matter where in the world you lived, everybody on Earth experiences seasons. And since you'd experienced this over and over again during the tens of years you lived, you'd notice that these cycles kept happening, which gives us the concept of the year and the seasons that it's divided into. The length of the year, of course, is the same for everyone, but the seasons it's divided into would be different depending on where you lived. And this is something that I would expect things other than Homo sapiens noticed. I would suspect that it'd also be noticed by our near relatives like Homo neanderthalensis and other near Homo sapiens. And I even suspect that the annual cycle of the seasons would be noticed by some other of the higher animals that have good memories. So I think that we've had the basic concept of the year with us for as long as we've been around.
Once people had the basic concept of the year, how'd they go about developing it?
Well, one of the things they did was try to find ways to track time within the year. That way they could predict how long the current season lasted and when the next one would begin. That was important whether you were living before or after the agricultural revolution that took place about 12,000 years ago or 10,000 BC. Before the invention of agriculture, humans depended on hunting and gathering for food. Well, animals have their own life cycles that makes them more available and good to hunt in certain seasons, and plants definitely are affected by the seasons, whatever the local seasons happen to be. In fact, different plants ripen and are thus available for gathering at different times. So the seasons were important to people before the agricultural revolution. And after we invented agriculture, they were definitely important. Crops grow in annual cycles and livestock breed in cycles as well. Notice that we were still doing the equivalent of hunting and gathering. It's just that after the agricultural revolution, we had taken control of the plants and animals that we were using to sustain ourselves. That way we'd have more dependable supplies of them and could produce what we needed in larger quantities, allowing our population to expand. Well, all that meant figuring out when in the year we are, and that's always been an important task. So we needed a way to track time inside the year. Obviously, the day-night cycle has always been with us, and it's important to keep track of what time of day it is as well. But the day is not that useful for keeping track of when in the year we are. I mean, you'd have to count up to 365 days to do that. And in some cultures, they have numbering systems that only include words for 1, 2, and many. Some have claimed that that's a myth, but it's not. The Walpiri tribe of Aborigines in Australia are an example. And even if you have a robust numbering system like we do, counting days is not a particularly useful way of keeping track of when in the year you are. So what we'd want is a way to map longer stretches of time than single days. And fortunately, the way our planetary system is set up, we've got one, because hanging right up there in the sky is our sister planet, the moon. The moon is most noticeable at night, but it's actually also out in the day as well. And for our purposes, it has a convenient way of keeping track of time for us because it goes through phases. Sometimes the moon is completely full, the full moon, then progressively more of its surface begins to be covered by darkness. This is referred to as the waning moon, and it goes in stages. At first, there's only a small portion of darkness, and this is referred to as the wane and gibbous moon. Then it's half covered in darkness. This is the wane and half moon. Then it's mostly covered in darkness, which is known as the wane and crescent moon. After it's waned, the moon is completely covered in darkness, which is known as the new moon. Then its surface starts to become visible again. This is known as the waxen moon, and it also goes through stages. When there's only a little bit of the surface visible, it's called the waxen crescent moon. When it's half visible, you're at the waxen half moon. And when it's mostly visible, it's the waxen gibbous moon, and then we're back at the full moon. This is a regular cycle, so you can use it as a timekeeping system. While the specific length of the lunar cycle varies a bit, it averages out, and it takes about 29.5 days for our sister planet to go through all of its phases. And so we started dividing the year up into chunks based on the phases of the moon. In Old English, the word for moon is monath, and we eventually shortened that to month. So the word month comes from the word for moon, and that's why the months are also approximately 30 days long, which is the same as the 29.5 days the moon takes to go through its cycles if you round up to the next day. And there are just over 12 moons or months each year, which is one reason why calendars around the world tend to have 12 months in them. It's not an arbitrary choice. It's based on the number of times that the moon goes through its phases in a year. The moon has thus been a key tool for humans to keep track of time with during the year. It's like a big sundial in the night sky. You can even use the moon to determine the length of the year itself.
Why is that? We associate the year with the motion of the sun. Why would people use the moon to determine the length of the year instead?
The problem is that the moon doesn't go through its phases an even number of times during the year. If you take the moon's average phase cycle as 29.5 days and multiply it by 12, that comes out to 354 days, but that's 11 days shorter than the 365 days it takes for the sun to return to the same spot on the horizon when it rises or sets. That's something else our ancestors noticed. Over time, the sun moves a bit to the right or to the left on the horizon. Back when I was a kid, I used to go out and watch the sun come up over the field behind my house. You couldn't do that today because they built a school there, but back when I was a kid, I'd sometimes get up before dawn and watch the sun come up and peek over the horizon. Well, if I'd been a careful observer doing that, I would have noted that in some seasons the sun would be a little more to the left, and in other seasons it would move a little more to the right. I could even plant a stick or a post or a rock in the middle of that range and watch the sun, watch what the sun would do with respect to that fixed point. And it would take 365 days for it to go through its full left and right cycle. It also would go through a full cycle of the seasons in that same time. So I could determine the length of the year as 365 days by using this method, and that's basically what some of our ancestors did. So now we have a choice. Which light in the sky are we going to follow? Are we going to use the sun, which gives us a year of 365 days, or are we going to use the moon and calculate 12 months as 354 days? Or are we going to try to do some kind of hybrid that incorporates both what the sun and the moon are doing in the sky? This gives rise to three different types of calendars. A solar calendar focuses on the motions of the sun, a lunar calendar focuses on the phases of the moon, and a lunisolar calendar focuses on the motions of the sun and the phases of the moon. And different groups of humans have made different choices on this question.
Since the seasons of the year are a big deal for humans, they determine what activities we're doing and how we get our food. How you keep track of time is a big decision that affects all society. Who in a society would make that kind of decision?
Well, this gets us into another aspect of human culture, and that's religion. If you're a hunter, you're going to want to do prayers and rituals to have a successful hunt. You may even want to do prayers and rituals during the mating season for the animals that you hunt so that there will be a lot of them when you go hunting. And if you're a farmer, you may want to pray and do rituals during the planting season so that you'll get the rain you need for your crops to grow. Or if you live in Egypt, you may want to pray and do rituals so that the Nile will flood the right amount for your crops. Not too little flooding or the crops won't grow well, and not too much flooding or that will cause big problems for you, but just like the Egyptian Goldilocks would have it, just the right amount of flooding to give you a good harvest. Then, after the hunting is over, if you're a hunter, you may want to pray and do rituals to give thanks for a successful hunt, including the successful hunting season. And if you're a farmer, you may want to pray and do rituals to give thanks for a successful harvest. But one way or another, the religious or ritual life of the community tends to be tied to the seasons of the year. And so it's the priests who are in charge of the community's religious or ritual life that tend to make these decisions. It's also because the priests are frequently specialists who don't have to do the work of hunting and planting, and so they have extra time to do things like make careful studies on the sun and the moon and other things that you see in the sky that could help you figure out what's going to happen in the future, like the behavior of clouds or comets or the motions of the stars and planets. So in cultures all across the world, it tends to be the priests who are the timekeepers.
If it's the priests who tend to keep track of time, let's look at some of the decisions they made in different cultures. First, let's talk about lunar calendars. Who chose these and why would they do so?
Well, lunar calendars aren't particularly common these days for reasons we'll talk about, but they have been more common in the past. It's definitely the case that the moon played a larger role in many calendars in the past, though they were often lunisolar calendars that also incorporated the motions of the sun. Today, there are 6 major calendars in use in the world, but only one of them, the Islamic calendar, is purely lunar. There's also the Javanese calendar that's used on the island of Java, but this one was a back formation based on the Islamic calendar. The principal reason that you'd want to choose a purely lunar calendar is that it's easier to keep track of the phases of the moon than it is the position of the sun on the horizon. All you have to do is look up and see what phase the moon is in. You don't have to set a marker on the horizon or things like that to keep track of the sun. So there's a practical benefit to just using the moon. It's easier. But there's also a big downside, which is that the lunar year is 11 or sometimes 12 days shorter than the solar year. And it's the solar year that controls the seasons, which means that your purely lunar year is going to get at least 11 days out of sync with the seasons every year, if you don't do something to keep them in alignment. That may not be a big deal if you live in the desert like Muhammad did. So, it's always hot or at least warm, and you're not really growing crops in the desert anyway. So those may be some reasons why Muhammad was okay with the lunar calendar, although there is some evidence that Muhammad may have inherited a purely lunar calendar from the pre-Islamic Arabs, though there is debate about whether it was purely lunar or lunisolar. In any event, if your year is 11 or 12 days shorter than the solar year, it will mean that your months get progressively out of sync with the seasons. If you divide 365 by 11, you get 33.18. So the months will progress through the seasons every 33 years, or twice in a common human lifespan. Thus, if you're born in a year when the month of Ramadan is in winter, let's say January, then when you're 16 or 17, Ramadan will be in summer or July. When you're 33, it'll be back in January. When you're 45 or 50, it will be back in July. When you're 66, it'll be back in January. And when you're 82 or 83, it'll be in July again. That may not be a big deal if you live in the desert, but if you live in other parts of the world where agriculture is a big deal, it matters a lot more. As a result, most cultures in recorded history have found ways of keeping the year in sync with the seasons.
That led to the development of the lunisolar calendar, which takes account of both the phases of the moon and the motions of the sun. Who uses them?
Lunisolar calendars are much more common, both today and in antiquity, than purely lunar calendars. According to Wikipedia,
the Chinese, Buddhist, Burmese, Assyrian, Hebrew, Jain, and Kurdish, as well as the traditional Nepali, Hindu, Japanese, Korean, Mongolian, Tibetan, and Vietnamese calendars in the East Asian Chinese cultural sphere, plus the ancient Hellenic, Collini, and Babylonian calendars are all lunisolar. Also, some of the ancient pre-Islamic calendars in South Arabia followed a lunar solar system.
So these have been very popular, and 3 of the 6 major calendars today, the Chinese, Indian National, and Hebrew calendars, are all lunisolar.
You said that these are not purely solar calendars, so do they take account of the phases of the moon? How does that work?
In his book, Calendar and Community, A History of the Jewish Calendar, 2nd century BCE to 10th century CE, Sasha Stern writes,
in almost all ancient lunar calendars, the month begins around the time of the new moon. Precisely when this is, however, varies considerably from one calendar to the next. The most common definition of the new moon is when the new crescent becomes visible for the first time. This occurs invariably in the evening, not long after sunset, and close to the point on the horizon where the sun has set. The first day of the month will generally begin, therefore, on that evening. This is the case, for instance, in the Babylonian calendar. In other calendars, the lunar month begins at an earlier time, when the old moon ceases to be visible. Since the old moon is visible for the last time in the morning, shortly before sunrise, and close to the point on the horizon where the sun will rise, the first day of the new month will generally begin on the first morning when the old moon is no longer visible. This is the case, for instance, in the Egyptian cultic calendar. In some calendars, finally, the new moon is given a more scientific definition. It is the moment of the conjunction. This is the case, for instance, in the Chinese calendar. Conjunction is the moment when the moon, along its orbit, passes between the sun and the earth. At this point, the moon is at minimal illumination. To the naked eye, it is completely invisible. In such calendars, the month will generally begin at some point, for example, morning or evening, of the day when conjunction occurs.
So, bottom line, different cultures would use the approximate time of the new moon to begin a new month. When the new moon began, so did the new month. But they varied on when they marked this point. The Babylonians used the sight-in of the beginnings of the littlest sliver of the new crescent moon, and that's also the system that was used by the ancient Hebrews. The Egyptians used the sight-in of the last little bit of the crescent of the old moon, and the Chinese would use the moment when the moon was invisible.
If that's how they determined when the new month began, how did they keep the months in sync with the seasons?
Lunisolar calendars use a process of what's known as intercalation to do this. Inter is Latin for between, and calare means to announce. So intercalation is what would happen when they announce a new segment of time is going to be inserted between some other segments, like we do in leap year when we insert February 29th between February 28th and March 1st. Leap year, or February 29th, is an intercalated day. Only in lunisolar calendars, they wouldn't just insert a day because that's not enough. The lunar year is 11 or 12 days shorter than the solar year, but if you wait 3 years, you'll be up at 33 or 36 days difference, and that's longer than the moon's normal cycle of 29.5 days. So what they would typically do is announce not a leap day, but a leap month every 2 or 3 years. For example, in the Jewish calendar, they have a month known as Adar, and so in intercalated years, they will do Adar twice. They will have a first Adar and a second Adar.
Okay, then, we've now solved the problem of how to keep the year in sync with the seasons. So why would anyone want to depart from this and use a purely solar calendar?
Well, there are some difficulties that using a lunisolar calendar has. They're not as bad as the problem of the months drifting through the seasons in a purely lunar calendar, but they're real. One of the problems is that if you're trying to sight the last little bit of the moon or the invisibility of the true new moon or the first little bit of the new moon, then you're dependent on human eyesight, and humans have different degrees of eyesight. Some people have really sharp eyesight, particularly the young, and some people have eyesight that isn't as good, particularly the elderly, and it tends to be the elderly who end up in charge of religious systems. So the old men, the religious elders who are in charge of announcing the beginning of the new month, aren't the best observers of the new moon. Other younger people with better eyesight will spot it a day or two before they do. The way they handled this in ancient Judah was they would bring eyewitnesses to the temple authorities and have them give testimony about what they saw. And they would specifically cross-examine them and ask them questions to test their answers and find out if they really had seen the new moon. A set of Jewish traditions known as the Mishnah was compiled around the year AD 200. The reason was to prevent knowledge from being lost, since the Jewish people no longer had a functioning temple. And so people were starting to have fuzzy memories of how things had been done back in temple times, like what exactly the temple authorities did back then for determining the start of the new month. So one of the segments of the Mishnah is named Rosh Hashanah. In Hebrew, Rosh means head, Ha means the, and Shana means year. So Rosh Hashanah means the head of the year, or what we would call New Year's Day, which is at a different time of year than it is on our calendar. Anyway, the tractate Rosh Hashanah has a lot of instructions about timekeeping in it, and it describes the procedure for declaring a new moon. First, they needed witnesses to testify that they had seen the new moon. And they didn't just want anybody as a witness. They wanted high-quality testimony from high-quality people. So the Mishnah says,
"These are the ones who are invalid to testify about the appearance of the new moon. 1. He who plays with dice. 2. They who lend on interest. 3. Who race pigeons. 4. And who trade in produce of the 7th year. 5. And slaves." This is the governing principle. Any evidence which a woman is not valid to offer, also they are not valid to offer.
Then, once they had the witnesses, they would all gather.
There is a large courtyard in Jerusalem called Bet Yazek, to which all the witnesses gather, and there the court examines them. Now they prepare big meals for them, so that they should make it a habit of coming.
So they'd feed you for your testimony, so that you'd keep coming back and they'd have a good supply of witnesses. But then they would cross-examine your testimony.
How do they examine the witnesses? The pair which makes its appearance first, do they examine first? They bring in the elder of them and say to him, "Tell us, how did you see the moon? Was it facing the sun or turned away from it? Was it to the north or to the south? How high was it? And in which direction was it leaning? And how broad was it?" If he said it was facing the sun, he has said nothing at all. Then they would bring in the second party and examine him. If their testimony coincided, their testimony was confirmed. And in the case of all the other pairs of witnesses, they asked the main points, not because they needed their evidence, but so that they should not go out disappointed, so that they would make it a habit of coming along in the future.
So they needed 2 witnesses to testify to the sighting of the crescent of the new moon, though they would ask everybody who showed up, in addition to feeding them a big meal, so that the people wouldn't be disappointed that they didn't get to give testimony and stop coming in the future, because you never knew which individuals would show up and you wanted an ample number of them. Notice that buried in what the authorities would ask the witnesses is a key question whose significance may not be obvious to the witnesses. It's kind of a trick question. Now, you can only sight the crescent of the brand new moon right after sunset, so the sun had just been in the sky. And they would ask whether the crescent on the new moon was facing the sun. That means with the horns of the crescent pointed towards the sun, or whether it was facing away from the sun, meaning that the center of the crescent was on the same side as the sun and the horns were pointing away. Now, the ancient Hebrews didn't necessarily know that it's the sun that causes the portions of the moon's surface to become visible that we can see. Some of the ancient Greek philosophers had worked that out, but it wasn't known to everyone in the ancient world. But there was one thing that just ordinary observation of the new moon would tell you, and that's that the horns of the new moon never point towards the sun. They always point away, since the sun will light up the part of the moon that's closest to it in the sky. The dark part of the moon will never face towards the sun. The horns of the crescent moon will never point towards the sun. That's why the Mishnah says that if a witness says that the crescent of the new moon was facing the sun, he has said nothing at all. His testimony is invalid. He's either lying or he saw something else, like maybe a wisp of cloud or something, perhaps coupled with eyesight that isn't as good as he thought. And then, after they had 2 witnesses to the new moon that they needed, they'd light flares to relay the message that the new month had started from hilltop to hilltop.
How did they kindle flares? They bring long cedar wood sticks, reeds, oleaster wood, and flax tow. One binds them together with a rope, and he goes up to the top of a hill and lights them. Then he waves them to and fro and up and down until he sees his fellow doing the same on the next hilltop, and so on the third hilltop and beyond.
I find all of these procedures really interesting, but as you can tell, the determination of the new month was based on eyewitnesses seeing the crescent of the new moon. And there were additional problems besides eyesight in making that determination. Sasha Stern explains,
the time interval between conjunction and the first visibility of the new moon is quite considerable and hence calendrically significant. Because of its small size and its proximity to the sun, the moon sliver is not visible to the naked eye immediately before or after the conjunction. The new crescent only becomes visible after it has reached a certain size, which is a function of its age and of other factors, and after it has become sufficiently distant from the sun. In addition, the new moon is only visible at a specific time of the day, between sunset and moonset. At this stage of the moon's orbit, the interval between sunset and moonset is often not more than a half an hour. It is only in this short period of time, when the sun is isolated from the moon and deep enough below the horizon, that the sky becomes sufficiently dark for the thin moon crescent to become visible against its background. As a result, the time interval between conjunction and first evening of visibility is often as long as 1 day, 24 hours. It ranges, however, at Mediterranean latitudes between a minimum of about 15 hours and a maximum of well over 2 days. This variation depends on earthly coordinates and the relative positions of sun and moon at sunset. First sighting of the new moon can also be further delayed, sometimes considerably, by weather conditions. Thus, in any lunar calendar, it makes a significant difference, typically of 2 calendar days, whether the moon begins at the conjunction or at the first sighting of the new moon.
And obstructions down low near to the horizon, like trees, buildings, and especially hills and mountains, could also interfere with the sighting of the new moon in the narrow window of time that it was visible. I've also seen archaeoastronomers discuss calculations they've done of how often people get the new moon sightings wrong. And they actually get the sightings wrong a huge percent of the time, which is one of the reasons that the Jewish temple authorities insisted on having more than one witness. And what do you do if it's just cloudy all week when the new moon is scheduled to appear? Well, in light of such situations, people started moving away from observation of the moon to determine the start of the month. They wanted a way to tell when the month began, no matter what the weather or the viewing conditions were. And that leads us in the direction of using calculations and tables rather than observation to determine things like this. In fact, in the first millennium AD, Jewish scholars started moving in this direction. They started using calculations rather than observations to determine the new moon. And instead of deciding when to add a second Adar based on agricultural observations, which is what they used to do, they now add second Adar based on a regular cycle, where they add the additional month 7 times in each 19 years in a predictable way. So today, the Hebrew calendar isn't as truly lunisolar as it once was. It has lunisolar roots, but it's not based on observing what is actually going on in the sky, but is calculation-based.
Of course, once you've detached your calendar from observing the phase of the moon, you're using what could theoretically be considered a purely solar calendar. So tell us about solar calendars. For a start, who uses them?
Solar calendars are associated with cultures that have good mathematics, since you need good math to do the calculations needed, as you're not just relying on observation to tell you when it's time for something like a month to start. Of the 6 major calendars in use today, 2 of them are solar, the Julian and the Gregorian calendars, both of which we'll talk about more. But solar calendars have been used by a lot of people. One of the earliest that we know about was introduced in Egypt around 2800 BC. The rising of the star Sirius, which heralded the flooding of the Nile River, was used as the marker for the new year. And in the calendar, there were 12 months that were each 30 days long, so that gave you a total of 360 days. Then, at the end of the year, there were 5 extra festival days that weren't part of a month. These 5 days were held in celebration of the births of the gods Osiris, Seth, Horus, Isis, and Nephthys. So you had a total of 365 days, which shows that the true length of the year was known to a high degree of approximation thousands of years before Christ. And even though the main Hebrew calendar is lunisolar, we also find some dissident Jewish communities using solar calendars. For example, in episode 319, we talked about the book of Jubilees, and in episode 323 and 324, we talked about the book of 1st Enoch. These two books describe a calendar that doesn't involve the moon at all. And the authors of the books absolutely insist on this and severely criticize those who use a calendar that's different that does involve the moon. They view the standard Hebrew calendar as a corruption that violates the will of God. Because the standard calendar was observation-based, months would start on different days of the week. And that meant that the religious feasts that were assigned to different days of the month would move from one year to another with respect to the days of the week. What the authors of Jubilees and Enoch wanted was for all religious feasts to be on fixed days with respect to the days of the week. So that, for example, Passover would always fall on a Wednesday every single year. The way they achieved this was by having the months always begin on the same day of the week. So, for example, the first month of the year always began on a Wednesday, and thus Passover would be celebrated 2 weeks later on the 15th, which would also be a Wednesday. But to get the months to start on the same day of the week, you had to ignore what the moon was doing and use a calculation-based system for determining the start of the month. The system they came up with was quite interesting. They divided the year into 4 quarters, each one of which was 13 weeks or 91 days long. 91 is 30 plus 30 plus 31. So in each quarter of the year, the first month would have 30 days, the second month would have 30 days, and the third month would have 31 days.
But wait a minute. If the year is divided into 4 quarters and each quarter is 91 days long, that gives us a total of 364 days in a year, but the solar year has 365 and a quarter days. So the Jubilees Enoch calendar would be missing a day and a quarter, and that'll add up over time and get it out of phase with the sun. How did the users of the calendar fix this?
The truth is, we don't know. They were certainly aware of the day and a quarter difference, but it's hard to imagine any fix they could have introduced, because any fix that kept the calendar in line with the solar year would involve starting the calendar on a different day of the week, and that would throw off the religious feasts, which was something they were very concerned about. Consequently, some scholars have proposed that this calendar was never actually meant to be used, that it represented a kind of idealized calendar that expressed God's will, but that couldn't be realized in this fallen world. On the other hand, other scholars point to evidence that suggests that the Qumran community actually used the calendar in practice. Qumran is a site near the Dead Sea where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and we talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls way back in episodes 9 and 35. It's commonly thought that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a group known as the Essenes, but whoever wrote them, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls were a separatist group that had rejected the Jerusalem temple as corrupt, and one of their big criticisms of the temple authorities was that they moved feasts, whereas the authors of the scrolls would not. So we have a mystery that has not been resolved. It looks like the 364-day solar calendar may have been used, but we have no idea whether they had a fix to keep it in sync with the solar year or whether they just let the differences accumulate from year to year.
And before we move on to discuss the rest of the calendars that we're going to discuss in the Mystery of the Year, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Stephanie D., Ann K., Todd H., Rosemary P., and Bob M. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Conceiving Crime, a gripping, new true crime podcast uncovering the darkest secrets the abortion, sex, and fertility industries hope you never hear. These industries operate in the shadows, where human life is treated as a product, mistakes are covered up, and crimes go unpunished. From professional surrogacy scammers to families torn apart by IVF, Conceiving Crime exposes the stories no one else will tell. What happens when life itself becomes a business? Find out at conceivingcrime.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, Jimmy, let's now look at the two major calendars we have left to consider, the Julian and the Gregorian. They're both solar calendars, and since the Gregorian is based on the Julian, let's start by talking about the Julian. What should we know?
Well, the Julian calendar was introduced by Julius Caesar, hence the name. He introduced it in Rome by decree in 46 BC, which is something that you get to do when you've been named dictator. And its use gradually spread elsewhere in the empire. It was a reform of a previous Roman calendar that is known creatively as the Roman calendar. But before we describe the Roman calendar, I'd like to point out something that should be puzzling if you think about it. Today, our months go January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December. And if you think about those names, and if you know anything about Latin, something should strike you as odd. The month of September starts with septem, and if you know your Latin, you'll know that septem means 7. The next month, October, starts with octo, and in Latin, octo means 8. That's why we call an octopus an octopus, because it has 8 legs. The next month is November, and in Latin, novem means 9. And the last month is December, while in Latin, decem means 10. So September is the 9th month, but its name means 7. October is the 10th month, but its name means 8. November is the 11th month, but its name means 9, and December is the 12th month, but its name means 10. What's up with this? The names of the month are out of phase with the sequence of the months in the calendar. It's like 2 months are missing. Well, according to various ancient Romans, that is the explanation. They claim that the original form of the Roman calendar only had 10 months. The first month was March, or in Latin, Martius, the month of the war god Mars. The second month was April, or Aprilis, after the goddess Apru, or Aphrodite. The third was May, or Maius, after Maia, the mother of the god Hermes. And the fourth was June, or Junius, after the goddess Juno. Then they started counting. The fifth month was called Quintilis, from quinque, or 5 in Latin. The sixth month was called Sextilis, or from sex, or 6 in Latin. The seventh month was September. The 8th month was October. The 9th month was November. And the 10th month was December. So 10 months with only the first 4 having proper names and the rest being based on numbers.
But wait a minute, if there were only 10 months, how did they cover 365 days? Were they each 36 or 37 days long?
No, they were only 30 or 31 days long on the Roman calendar, and they didn't cover all 365 days. They only covered 304 days. Instead, the Romans using this calendar, according to some of our sources, just didn't cover the time of winter because it was irrelevant to the agricultural cycle as crops weren't growing. So there were 61 days of the year that didn't belong to any month. But that proved unsatisfactory. So according to ancient sources, Numa Pompilius, the second legendary king of Rome, the one after Romulus, decided to expand the calendar to cover the whole year. He thus created January, or in Latin, Januarius, after the two-faced god Janus, and February, or Februarius, after the god of purifications, Februus. We thus got a 12-month year, though I should point out that our sources are late and sometimes in conflict, so modern scholars debate exactly what happened with this calendar.
So now the Roman calendar covered all 365 days of the year?
Actually, no. By Julius Caesar's time, the months had lengths of between 28 and 31 days long, with many of them just being 29 days long. And so they only covered 355 days of the year. So every year, the calendar would go 10 days out of sync with the seasons. To fix this, the Romans would do what everybody does in such situations. They intercalated. Like the Jews, they would add an extra month every 2 or 3 years. This month was sometimes called intercalaris because it was intercalated, and it was sometimes called mercedonius from the Latin word merces, which means wages, so it was the month of wages. But there was another problem with this month. You'll remember that it tends to be priests who are in control of the calendar. Well, in Rome, they had a college of priests known as the pontiffs, and the head of this college was known as the Pontifex Maximus. After Rome became Christians, Christians borrowed this terminology, which is why the Pope is sometimes called the Supreme Pontiff. Well, religion and politics mixed in ancient Rome, so the pontiffs could also serve in government positions. And since politics ruins everything, this led to politicking with the month of Mercedonius. You see, if you were a pontiff who was currently serving in a high government position, you could remain in power longer if you declared that a given year would have Mercedonius. But if you were a pontiff and your enemies were in political power, you could get them out of power quicker by not declaring that the year would have Mercedonius. This politicking led to the calendrical reform initiated by Julius Caesar. Rome was ruled for a period by a group of 3 strong men known as the First Triumvirate, triumvir meaning being Latin for the 3 men. But this broke down and led to civil war. Julius Caesar emerged victorious, and he decided he wanted to introduce a better calendar. One of the things he wanted to do was end the politicking with Mercedonius, so he abolished that month altogether. To compensate for the loss of the intercalated month, he added 1 or 2 days to most of the months. This extended the total length of the calendar from 355 days by 10 more days, so it now totaled 365 days, which is very close to the length of the solar year. However, even back then, back in his day, they knew that the solar year is about 6 hours or a quarter of a day longer than that. So to keep things in sync, Caesar added an intercalated day, not an intercalated month, every 4 years. And since February was already short and it was where they shoved in the intercalated month, that's where they decided to put the intercalated day. Only they didn't put it at the end of the month like we do. Instead, they put it further inside the month. In the Roman system, the calends was the first day of the month. So the first day of March was the calends of March. Augustus Caesar, Julius's successor, used to joke about people who were stingy and wouldn't pay you, that they would pay on Greek calends, since the Greeks didn't use calends. But anyway, calends was the beginning of the month in Roman reckoning, and they didn't have day numbers in the form that we do. So what they would do is count backwards inclusively from the calends to tell you how many days before the next calend something happened if it was close to the end of the month. So if you wanted to specify a date in late February, you'd start on the calends of March and then count backwards, including that day. So March 1st was day 1, February 28th was day 2, February 27th was 3, February 26th was 4, February 25th was 5, and February 24th was 6. So February 24th was reckoned as the 6th day before the calends of March, and this is where they'd insert their leap day. They would double the 6th day before the calends of March. In other words, they'd have February 24th twice. They'd call the first February 24th the second 6th day before the calends of March, and they'd call the second February 24th just the 6th day before the calends of March. But in later centuries, that changed, and now we just add a leap day at the end of the month. So now we have February 29th every 4 years or so, which gave us this surprise and plot twist in Gilbert and Sullivan's The Pirates of Penzance.
For some ridiculous reason, to which, however, I've no desire to be disloyal. Some person in authority.
Who?
I don't know who. Very likely the astronomer royal has decided that, although for such a beastly month as February, 28 days as a rule are plenty. 1 year in every 4, his days shall be reckoned as 9 and 20. Through some singular coincidence, I shouldn't be surprised if it were owing to the agency of an ill-natured fairy. You are the victim of this clumsy arrangement, having been born in leap year on the 29th of February. And so, by a simple arithmetical process, you will easily discover that though you've lived 21 years,
Yes, that's right.
yet if we go by birthdays, you're only 5 and a little bit over.
Dear me, let's see. Yes, with yours my figures do agree. I'm in a portal that's rich. I'll point the ways of paradox at common sense she gaily mocks. Though counting in the usual way, yes, 21 I've been alive. Yet reckoning by my natal day. Yet reckoning by my natal day. 1, 2, 3, 4. I am a little boy of 5.
He's a little boy of 5.
A paradox, a most ingenious paradox. A curious paradox. A most ingenious
In any event, now the calendar spanned 365 and a quarter days in line with the solar year. And those are the basics of Julius Caesar's reform of the calendar.
When did Julius Caesar implement his reform?
Basically, it went into effect in 45 BC, but because the calendar in Rome had already gotten out of sync with the seasons, there was some preparatory work that needed to be done. That work was done the previous year in 46 BC. To catch up, they'd already announced an intercalated month of Mercedonius, and Julius Caesar then announced 2 extra special intercalated months between November and December. The result was that 46 BC ended up being 445 days long, or 80 days longer than normal. But now that they were caught up, the Julian calendar was off and running.
But wait, how did the months of the year get the names they have now? The Julian calendar, as you described it, still has the months Quintilis and Sextilis on it.
That's something that happened after Julius Caesar's time. In addition to the calends, or first day of the month, the Romans also had special names for a couple of other points in the month. One of them was nones, which was either the 5th or 7th day of the month, and the other was ides, which was either the 13th or 15th day of the month. Well, March was one of the months where the Ides fell on the 15th, and according to the ancient Greek biographer Plutarch, a soothsayer told Caesar,
"Beware the Ides of March."
And it was on the Ides of March, or March 15th of 44 BC, that a group of senators conspired to assassinate Julius Caesar in the Roman Senate. So if anyone you know scoffs at conspiracy theories and tells you that conspiracies aren't real, you can remind them of the conspiracy to kill Julius Caesar, among numerous others that we've covered on this show and that were totally real, which is why we have laws against conspiracies. A conspiracy being an agreement between 2 or more people to commit an illegal act in the future, like the mob. Well, after Caesar was dead, the Senate had some killer's remorse in 44 BC, and they decided to rename the month of Quintilis after Julius Caesar because it was his birth month. So Quintilis became Julius, or July. Later, in 8 BC, the month of Sextilis was renamed Augustus, or August, to honor Julius's successor, Augustus Caesar. There were also some attempts to rename other months after other emperors, but none of them ended up sticking. So that completes the story of how we got our modern month names.
Then let's talk about what replaced the Julian calendar. First of all, why would anyone want to replace it? It seemed to be working well with its 365 days plus an extra leap day every 4 years.
Well, at first that was true, but even the ancients knew that the solar year was not quite 365 and a quarter days long. They weren't sure of its exact value. They didn't have the way to measure it as precisely as we do today, and they didn't worry about this too much. It was fine for the time, the Julian calendar was, but as the centuries rolled along, the calendar started to get out of sync with what the sun was doing. This was a particular problem for Christians because they dated Easter, the holiest day on the Christian calendar, more important than even Christmas, based on the date of the spring equinox, since Christ was crucified at Passover and the date of Passover was determined by the spring equinox on the Jewish calendar. The date of Easter was so important to Christians that it caused more than one serious ruckus in the early church, but it was important for Christians to celebrate it together. And so in AD 325, at the very first ecumenical council, the Council of Nicaea, a unified date of celebration was agreed upon. But this date was on the Julian calendar that was in use at the time. And as the centuries rolled along, the Julian calendar got out of sync with the sun and the timing of the spring equinox. By the 1500s, the calendar was 10 days out of sync, and the Julian calendar's spring equinox was occurring before its supposed date of March 21st. To fix things, and before the problem got any worse, Pope Sixtus IV commissioned a review of the problem in 1475, but this project was delayed by the death of the astronomer he asked to do it. The task was taken up again in the 1540s after the Council of Trent wanted Pope Paul III to reform the calendar, and things got serious. The new calendar was then put into effect under Pope Gregory XIII, which is why it's called the Gregorian calendar, and that happened in 1582.
How did the new calendar differ from the Julian one?
Basically, there were two differences. The first was that they skipped some days to resync the calendar with the spring equinox. There had been a proposal to catch up gradually over a period of decades, but they decided to do it all at once. So the last day under the Julian calendar was Thursday, October 4th, 1582. Now you'd expect that the next day would be Friday, October 5th, but to catch up those 10 days that they were out of sync, they skipped directly to October 15th. So October 4th, 1582 was followed immediately by October 15th, 1582. The second difference was a modification of the leap year rule to keep them from getting out of sync again. The problem was that the Julian calendar's length of 365.25 days, which had a leap year every 4 years, was close to the solar year but not exact. There's more than one type of solar year. For example, one of them is the tropical year and the other is the sidereal year. In Greek, tropikos means turn in or return. So the tropical year is the time that it takes for the sun to return to the same spot in the sky as measured by its celestial coordinates. By contrast, in Latin, sidereus means starry. So the sidereal year is how long it takes for the sun to return to the same position in the sky as measured by the background stars. But the background stars change position slightly over time due to a 26,000-year-long cycle known as the precession of the equinoxes, while the celestial coordinates don't change. So it's the tropical year that they're trying to sync the calendar with. The Julian calendar was 365.2500 days long, but the tropical year is only 365.2422 days long. So if you subtract that, the Julian calendar was 0.0078 days too long, and that's what kept throwing it out of sync. And the problem was in the leap days, those extra days they were adding every 4 years. They were adding them too frequently. They were adding too many of them. So the Gregorian calendar reduced the number of leap days. The new rule was that they would add a leap day in every year that was divisible by 4, unless the year is divisible by 100, in which case you don't have a leap day, unless the year is divisible by 400, in which case you do have a leap day. So during a given century, all of the years divisible by 4 have leap days. Thus, 2020, 2024, 2028, and 2032 all have leap days. But century years like 1800, 1900, and 2100 don't have leap days. But centuries divisible by 400, like 1600, 2000, and 2400, do have leap days. The result is that instead of having 100 leap days in 400 years, we only have 97. And that decrease of 3 leap days in 400 years allows the Gregorian calendar to approximate the tropical year. It also means that the year 2000, for those who remember that, was a special year in that it was only the second time that the Gregorian calendar hit a century mark that did have a leap day.
And this prevents the year from getting out of sync with the solar year the way the Julian calendar did.
Well, it'll prevent it for a long time. But what we're trying to do here is build a mathematical algorithm that emulates a natural phenomenon, and that's very hard to do. Natural phenomena are messy, and they resist being mathematically modeled exactly. For example, over very long time scales, Earth's rotation is slowing down, which will throw things off. And to compensate for that, the appropriate officials introduce a leap second every few years to keep their timekeeping equipment in sync with the Earth's rotation. That's our own modern scientific form of intercalation. I remember back in 2016, the annual satirical event at Harvard University known as the Ig Nobel Prizes put on a whole mini-opera in 3 acts about the concept of the leap second.
Hey, got a sec. I need to check. What is the purpose of the leap second? Why on earth? What is it worth? But tell me, how is the leap second reckoned?
That's what we add when time goes bad. Just give me a min. Oh, make your head spin.
We'll have a link to a video of the award ceremony so that you can watch the mini opera and all of the other fun stuff they did. And the Ig Nobel Prizes are really funny, so I recommend them. But the bottom line is that the Gregorian calendar is good to go for thousands of years. I've seen estimates that it won't be off by a day for like 3,000 to 8,000 years. And if the Lord tarries that long, they can easily take care of the problem with a one-off day adjustment or with a longer-term solution. Back in the 1800s, Sir John Herschel proposed a modification where you drop a leap year in the year 4000 and all future multiples of 4000. So this would add a fourth unless clause or an additional unless clause. Others have supported this proposal, but the year 4000 is still a long way off, so no action has been taken on this proposal yet.
How did the Gregorian calendar spread after it was introduced?
Well, it spread quite rapidly in Catholic countries. The Pope didn't impose it on them. He declared it for the papal states, but then other Catholic countries adopted it. But it was slower to spread in non-Catholic countries. Protestants, for example, weren't wild about introducing a new calendar that had been announced by the Pope, and so adoption was slower in Protestant countries. Thus, England didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar for 170 years, but they finally did in 1752. Orthodox countries took even longer. Many of them did not adopt the Gregorian calendar until the early 20th century, and even then, many adopted it only for their civil calendar, and they may still use the Julian calendar for determining religious holidays. The last country to adopt the Gregorian calendar was Greece, which adopted it in 1923. Other non-Christian countries also adopted it, at least for their civil calendar. They may use other calendars for special purposes, but the Gregorian calendar is now the global standard because it's just better than the Julian calendar. And a particularly interesting situation occurred in the former Soviet Union. The revolution that brought the Soviets to power began on October 25th, 1917, and it became known as the October Revolution. but that was on the Julian calendar. Afterward, they adopted the Gregorian calendar, and by this point, they needed to jump 13 days. So on the Gregorian calendar, the date of the revolution became November 7th, 1917. And as a result, the Soviet Union had an October revolution that actually began in November. And anytime you read about the Russian Revolution, they have to go through all this.
That kind of confusion is going to occur anytime you have a change in the calendar date. How has the switch between the Julian and the Gregorian calendars been handled elsewhere?
At least in the English language, it's been handled by introducing two new terms, Old Style and New Style, which are abbreviated OS and NS. The Old Style date was the date on the Julian calendar, and the New Style date was the date on the Gregorian calendar. So to help ease confusion, once the new calendar was introduced, people would often indicate whether they were given the date according to the old style of reckoning it or the new style of reckoning it. And they'd often list both dates together, especially during the transition period when people were still getting used to the new calendar.
That's okay for transition periods, but what about dates long in the past? Like if we want to talk about something that happened centuries ago when people were still using the Julian calendar.
There is a way to do this with the Gregorian calendar. There's a tool known as the proleptic Gregorian calendar. Prolepsis is a word that means anticipation. So the proleptic Gregorian calendar anticipates the introduction of the Gregorian calendar by projecting its dates backward onto earlier dates. For example, the Gregorian calendar came into effect on October 15th, 1582, New Style. So the day before that would be October 14th, 1582 on the proleptic Gregorian calendar, even though at the time everybody called it October 4th, 1582 Old Style. However, and although I haven't checked to see what scholars are doing in every field of study, my understanding is that at least biblical chronologers and other historians tend to just use whatever calendar was employed at the time they're writing about. You know, especially like biblical chronologers, they have to translate dates between all different kinds of calendars, like the Hebrew calendar and the Julian calendar and the Babylonian calendar. And it's just easier to stick with what people were using rather than introducing a new dating system that's similar but wouldn't be invented for almost 1,600 years. Biblical chronologer Andrew Steinman writes about this in his book From Abraham to Paul.
The difference between the Julian and Gregorian calendars is a slight one, but is important when assigning dates to ancient events, which are always calculated using the Julian calendar. Thus, for instance, the tables of dates given in the widely used Babylonian chronology compiled by Parker and Duberstein are Julian dates and assume every fourth year is a leap year. This distinction is also important for determining the day of the week for an ancient event.
Thus, I've previously written about the chronological factors that make it probable that Jesus was crucified on Friday, April 3rd, AD 33. But that's its date on the Julian calendar because the Julian calendar was in use at the time. If you adjust, it would be April 1st, AD 33 on the proleptic Gregorian calendar. So, Jesus wasn't going to stay dead. April Fools!
So using the Julian calendar for historical dates is fine for historians, but what about scientists like astronomers who need to use math to calculate things like when ancient eclipses occurred, or the motions of the planets in ancient times, or the difference between the calendars would really mess up their calculations. So what do?
They have a number of systems that they use. One problem is that the Gregorian calendar uses the Anno Domini, or in the year of the Lord system for numbering years that was invented in AD 525 by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, or Dennis the Short. Well, back in 525, zero wasn't a thing yet in Western mathematics, so there is no year zero in the AD system. It jumps directly from 1 BC to 1 AD, and that absence of a zero makes it hard for scientists to put the years on a number line or do calculations. So a common solution in astronomy is to modify the AD system so that it does include a year zero. This is known as the astronomical year numbering, and all of the AD year numbers are the same, but 1 BC is now the year zero, 2 BC is the year -1, 3 BC is the year -2, and so on. A bigger problem for doing calculations, though, is the months. What astronomers really need to do is turn the dates into a string of pure decimal numbers, like the star dates on Star Trek. And so they use one of two systems, the Julian date system and the modified Julian date system. These are based on the Julian calendar, which assumes a leap year every 4 years. The Julian date system just starts by counting days from January 1st, 4713 BC. And so January 1st is Julian day 1, January 2nd is Julian day 2, and so on until you get into the millions. It thus includes all astronomical events in recorded human history, since we didn't have writing in 4713 BC. In the modified Julian date system, they start counting with midnight universal time on November 17th, 1858, which had a Julian date of 2,400,000.5. All of the times previous to this were negative numbers. So the previous day, November 16th, 1858, had a modified Julian date of -1. November 15th, 1858 had a modified Julian date of -2, and so on. So scientists do have ways of converting dates into formats that they need to do mathematical calculations. And there are tools that will convert between calendar dates for you, and we'll have a link to one such resource.
Let's discuss one aspect of the year that we haven't talked about thus far, which is when it begins. Has January 1st always been the beginning of the year?
Actually, no. There have been a variety of points at which the year has been reckoned as started on different calendars. It's even been inconsistent over the history of the Julian calendar. But we won't go into that history because there are a bunch of dates that have been used as the beginning of the year, and it would be quite complex. I will note, though, that in some cultures, they even have more than one new year every year. Sometimes that's because they're using the Gregorian calendar and the Chinese calendar, so they kind of have two New Years. But other times, even in a single calendar, they may have New Years for different things. For example, the Hebrew calendar has 4 New Years. According to the Mishnah,
there are 4 New Years. 1, the first day of Nisan, is the new year for kings and festivals. 2, the first day of Elul is the new year for tithing cattle. R. Eleazar and R. Simeon say it is on the first day of Tishra. 3, the first day of Tishra is the new year for reckoning of years, for sabbatical years, and for jubilees, for planting trees and for vegetables. 4, the first day of Shabbat is the new year for trees, in accordance with the opinion of the house of Shammai. The house of Hillel say, on the 15th day of that month is the new year for trees.
So the Hebrew calendar has 4 New Years. The first is for determining the reigns of kings and the dates of festivals. So each time this new year passes, a king adds another year to his reign. The second is for tithing cattle. So any cattle born after this date count towards the next tithing cycle. The third is for reckoning a variety of functions, including the start of sabbatical years and jubilee years. And the fourth is the new year for trees, which you use to reckon how many years a tree is old. It's considered as many years old as the number of New Years it's seen. This is important because you're not allowed to eat any fruit of the tree for the first 3 years of its life, and the fruit of the 4th year is regarded as holy to God. So you don't get to eat any of a tree's fruit until it's seen 5 New Years for trees. I also love the idea of trees like putting on party hats and staying up till midnight and having New Year's celebrations.
So let's close by looking forward with the history of the calendar. We've already noted how the Gregorian calendar has been and could be modified in the future, but what about other planets and moons? What if we start colonizing them?
Well, I don't think we have to worry about that for a long time. Just like astronauts in the International Space Station still use the Gregorian calendar, even though they're going around the Earth every 90 minutes or so their days are only 90 minutes long. I think that as long as humans are in our own solar system, the cultural influence of Earth will mean that they will continue to use the Gregorian calendar that Earth Society uses as an international standard. That's not to say that other calendars won't be used in addition. For example, a Chinese base on our sister planet, the Moon, may also use the Chinese calendar. There may even be local calendars based on planetary conditions elsewhere. For example, on Mars, the day is a little over 24 and a half hours long. So I suspect that Elon Musk's Mars colonists will adapt to using days that long, as it's not very far off the Earth day of 24 hours. And the Martian year is 687 days long, so almost twice the length of an Earth year. I can thus see local Martians using a calendar that has more months than our 12, like in Mystery Science Theater 3000's version of the classic 1964 Christmas movie, Santa Claus Conquers the Martians.
Something is wrong with our children.
On Saturn III.
They eat not, they sleep not.
They are not.
Their only interest is watching meaningless Earth programs on the video.
Are there any other kind? But I digress.
What time of year is it now?
It is the middle of September.
Oh, time for Septoberfest.
So you could get extra months just by inserting new ones between the existing ones. After September comes Septober, then October, then Octovember, and so on. However, I suspect that in reality, they would come up with all new month names to avoid confusion with the Earth months. But as long as the Martians don't have a revolution where they hate Earth with a passion so that they're still in communication with Earth, close communication, I suspect that the Gregorian calendar will still be used as the civil calendar of Mars. So Martian colonists would typically celebrate Christmas twice in a Martian year, whenever it's December 25th on the Gregorian calendar, because you don't want to wait to celebrate Christmas only every 687 days when you could celebrate it every 365. So, should we ever get out of our own solar system and start colonizing planets in situations where the colonists aren't in close contact with Earth? Well, I suspect they'll come up with calendars better adapted to whatever planets they're on. Bearing in mind the regular human need for sleep, which imposes limits on how long your legal day can be. And I expect that for the foreseeable future, they'll be celebrating major holidays like Christmas and Easter at the same points in time that people on Earth do. Now, I should mention that there's a lot more we can say about the year and timekeeping, but I've kept this episode deliberately simple, and we may discuss further aspects of these subjects in future episodes.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line here?
The year is a mysterious subject. Early humans noticed the year, and they figured out various ways to keep time during it. These were initially and principally based on the day and the phases of the moon. Some calendars were purely lunar, like the Islamic calendar, but the need to keep the calendar in sync with the seasons led to the development of lunisolar calendars, like the Hebrew calendar. And eventually, cultures started working with calendars based purely on calculation rather than observation. This led to solar calendars like the Julian calendar, but even this otherwise very successful calendar didn't stay fully in sync with the seasons over long periods of time, which led to the development of the Gregorian calendar that's now used all over the world. Still, the Gregorian calendar isn't perfect because natural processes are messy. Over thousands of years, it too will need minor tweaks, and should we ever get out of the solar system, we may see even more interesting calendars develop.
Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to the listeners and viewers?
We'll have links to Jack Finnegan's book, Handbook of Biblical Chronology, Andrew Steinman's book, From Abraham to Paul, Sasha Stern's book, Calendar and Community, the Mishnah, also an introduction to calendars, information about lunar calendars, lunisolar calendars, the Islamic calendar, the Hebrew calendar, the Chinese calendar, the Indian national calendar, the Roman calendar, the Julian calendar, the Gregorian calendar, and a calendar converter tool so you can keep all of that straight. Also, the 2016 Ig Nobel Prizes, where in addition to handing out the prizes, they also have that 3-act mini opera about leap seconds. And we'll have a link to Mystery Science Theater 3000's version of Santa Claus Conquers the Martians.
And now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi. And this week's feedback comes from our episode 357, The Rapture. Our first feedback comes from Illyrian Highlander on YouTube, who writes, I think the problem a lot of people have with amillennialism is the devil being bound, because if he's bound, then why is there so much evil? If it wasn't for this, I would agree 100%. Just there's so much evil in the world, and if you consider Islam, they're 100% preventing the gospel being preached in their lands.
Well, it's true that in Saudi Arabia, there is a wide-scale prohibition on the preaching of the gospel, although there's actually a much bigger Christian movement there than you might think. There are widespread reports, which I've been looking into, and I plan to have a future episode on this. But there are widespread reports of Jesus appearing to Muslims in dreams and converting them to Christianity. And there is a, clandestine church movement in Muslim lands, including in Saudi Arabia. And there's some really interesting stories about that. But that would be another illustration, regardless of the attitude of the political authorities in Saudi Arabia, that Jesus is still spreading the gospel in today's world, even in Muslim lands. Also, Muslims in general worship the God of Abraham. They worship the creator who appeared to Abraham. So do Jews. And the world is just not in pagan darkness the way it was 2,000 years ago. If you look at the state of the world today, it is drastically different than it was in the time of Jesus. And the gospel and the worship of the true God has advanced enormously compared to what it was back then. And so Christians have historically looked at the situation and said, yeah, it looks like the devil's bound in this way. He's not deceiving the nations the way he was before. That's not to say there's no evil in the world or there's no deception of the nations going on, but it is vastly diminished compared to what it was before. And one of the things you have to realize when you read biblical prophecy is that there is flexibility here, that you can't take a statement that says, the devil is going to be bound and he's not going to be able to deceive the nations, and that's going to mean absolutely everyone in the world is going to have theologically correct opinions. Because, among other things, the devil is not the only source of evil in the world. He's one of the classic three, the world, the flesh, and the devil. But that's just one of the three. And so you have to look at prophecy with some flexibility in terms of how it's fulfilled. And it looks like we got a plausible fulfillment here.
All right. And then our next feedback comes from Keely Emerine, Mix1051 on YouTube, who writes, I'm Protestant, but I lament the kind of theology that has you scouring the newspapers on one hand and the scriptures on the other, looking for the truth. It leads to dangerous practice, as all theology does, and keeps us focused on events and not on our glorious Savior. Religious counterfeits are still counterfeits. One question, Jimmy. I've never had a rapture holder answer this. When Jesus returns for a post-tribulation, pre-millennial rapture, is that return the sort of halfway in the air but unofficial second coming as the pre-trib? Or would a rapture after the tribulation involve what we all understand to be the second coming? Thank you if you're able to answer. Actually, thank you anyway.
Well, before I answer the question, I just thought I'd comment on a thought that struck me, which is, you mentioned scouring the newspaper, and in Protestant circles, this is sometimes called newspaper exegesis, where you try to interpret biblical prophecy in terms of what's going on in the newspaper. And I agree, that is a total mistake. On the other hand, I find it ironic that the Swiss Protestant theologian Karl Barth was famous for saying that ministers should preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. He meant something different. He wasn't talking about newspaper exegesis. He was talking about, taking biblical principles and applying them to the issues that are in the world today. Like, back in the 1940s or 30s or 40s, preaching against Nazis and stuff like that. In terms of the question, it's going to depend if you have a post-tribulational rapture And so Jesus comes back after the tribulation. Is that going to be the same thing as the second coming or not? It's going to depend on what you mean by the second coming. If you bundle into the idea of the second coming the concepts of the dead, all of the dead being raised and judged, and the introduction of the eternal order, then that wouldn't be the second coming, because those things don't happen yet. There would be a very long period, symbolized by 1,000 years, before the resurrection of all of the dead and the final judgment and the eternal order. On the other hand, if you just mean Jesus comes back, and well, then yeah, he does come back to the earth, and so it would be a post-tribulational rapture, would be the second coming in that sense.
All right. And then our next feedback comes from Bible History Science 3530 on YouTube, who writes, Darby didn't invent these ideas. The book Dispensationalism Before Darby by William C. Watson proved and cites believers, I think there's a typo in there, cites believers in the 1300s using the word rapture, to describe Elijah being raptured into the heavens, and he found records going back to the early 1600s where believers were writing about being saved from end times destruction, the Great Tribulation. And of course, the one source that matters is the Bible, so the rapture goes back to ancient times.
Well, as we discussed in our episode on the rapture, there is an event that is where believers get caught away to be with Christ. That's in 1 Thessalonians 4. It's also mentioned in 2 Thessalonians. And if you want to call that the rapture, that's fine. Yeah, there is a rapture concept that, or something you can call the rapture, that goes back to ancient times and is in the Bible. But the question is, where does the Bible situate this? Does it situate it before or during a tribulation that precedes 1,000-year earthly reign of Christ? And in particular, does this whole scenario involve the nation of Israel and things like that, those are sort of the key features, the pre-tribulational rapture and the involvement of Israel, that are the key features of the dispensationalist eschatology. Now, William Watson's book, Dispensationalism Before Darby, unfortunately is out of print, so I haven't been able to consult it. I don't know exactly what it says, but I have my strong suspicion is that it does something which other dispensationalist works have done. In order to try to find a historic pedigree for dispensationalism, what dispensationalist authors will sometimes do is they will look back into history and find things that are sort of elements that were later incorporated into dispensationalism, or that are similar to things dispensationalists say, and then say, okay, these guys were dispensationalists. Well, no, they weren't. Dispensationalism is a system that puts these things together. And just because you've got a predecessor that had an idea that dispensationalism later incorporated doesn't make that person a dispensationalist. And just because someone says something that sounds similar to what dispensationalists later said, well, that doesn't make the person a dispensationalist either. And credible historians have not found the dispensationalist package being proclaimed by people before John Nelson Darby. He really was the originator of this. To give an example, just from what Bible History Science 3530 says, he says that in the book, Watson found believers in the 1300s using the word rapt to describe Elijah being raptured into the heavens. Okay, fine. Rapt is an English word. It's not very common today, but it means being caught away or transported or things like that. So it was an English word, and it was also a Latin word before that. And it's going to get used to describe things, but that doesn't make any time the word rapt or rapture show up a reference to the rapture. The rock group Blondie has a song called Rapture, but it is not about the biblical idea of the rapture that dispensationalists proclaim. You can use the same word in other contexts, and that's very obviously going on here because, as Bible History Science 3530 said, they were using it to refer to Elijah being caught up into the heavens. Okay, that occurred about 850 years before Christ. So, there was someone being caught up into the heavens 850 years before Christ, but that is not what dispensationalists are talking about when they talk about the rapture. They're talking about a future event, not one that happened 2,850 years ago. So that's very clearly just the same word being applied to a different event, and that means we're not talking about the same event here. So I wish I could check out Watson's book. Like I said, unfortunately, it's not in print, but fundamentally, the scholarly consensus seems to stand that although there were things that earlier people had done that were similar or that used similar language, the idea of dispensationalism and its premillennial rapture really didn't get popularized until the time of John Nelson Darby.
Very good. And that's all of our feedback. Thank you, everyone, for sending in your feedback. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about the mystery of the year in the calendar? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. They're available for hire, so they can do your video work too. You can check out the work by going to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, you can help me by liking, commenting, sharing the podcast with others, and subscribing. And at time of recording, we're trying to get up to 100,000 subscribers. Please help us get there by subscribing, and be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Over the history of the show, we've devoted several episodes that look at experiences that people often have as they're nearing death, like terminal lucidity and deathbed visions. But back in episode 203, we looked at the possibility that animals, or at least some of them, also have an afterlife. So next week, we're going to look at some recent research about the end-of-life experiences that people report their animals having and how similar they are to those that humans experience.
Fascinating. Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where, as he said, you should hit the bell to get notifications. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/365. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.